but we'll try to talk today a little bit. My perspective will be as a poet who likes to share. In my poems, a lot of what I do is create little documentaries about family and, of course, myself. But today I'm focusing on family, but also can't help but intersect with my own world as well. And as a preface, though, I want to repeat a few things Harry said last week. Hi, Harry. So, because when he was reflecting on the importance of mediating a relationship with fact-based evidence as we sort of create who we are and stuff, he said, use these facts to make a good narrative, a good life. Take the facts and make an interesting, meaningful story. And so here we have the idea that we create our lives through our stories, and our stories through our lives, sifting through information to form identities. And we find all kinds of facts. And so I think the idea about narratives affects us on, as he talked about, a personal level, but also historical, familial, political, cultural, and all that. And as we shape our stories, or silence them, it has a ripple effect. Anyway, so I've called this embroidering on the family tree because on one hand, we do embroider on facts sometimes, but we also embroider the truth on top of whatever life gives us sometimes. So that's sort of what I'm talking about. And my goal is to invite you to reflect on how we create our stories in poetry or in conversation. And I have 5 poems I'll read and talk about a little bit, and hope that you will save up some questions to ask me, and also reflect and converse and all that. That's the more important part. So I will look a tiny bit, sorry, I just got a tiny bit scripted, but anyway, so I had to write my poems down. I don't have them all memorized. So the first question I'll ask and maybe answer is, why do we write poems anyway? And probably I should say, why do I write them? There are a million answers to that one simple little question. But I'm going to answer this by contrasting something I wrote in my journal on February 22nd, 2011. I keep a daily sort of journal. I call it a day book. And at the end of the day, I write stuff down and sometimes reflect. And then I'm going to contrast that with a poem I wrote 5 years later about the same experience. And so here's the journal entry said, I got to sit on the porch with Mama at Grace today because I remarked on the pretty day to a woman going in, flu sign up, about the pretty day. So she turned. They bundled Mama up. I gave her a flower and some Godiva chocolate. She talked. She is still there, so sweet, so ancient, so sick. And then I wrote lunch at Wildflower, ran into E. She survived 23 years, had BC at my age, also SS and JW, crying a lot. That was me crying a lot. I keep track of stuff. So I've written many, many poems about my mother, and many of those are in Waltzing with Horses that some of you know. But after she died, I thought, well, that's it. I've spent my whole life trying to make sense of her and her life and how that has affected me and my interesting relationship with her. And my phone is off, but it's still dinging. I apologize for that. But I realized you never lose that flood subject. I'll keep writing poems about Mama. In fact, the project I'm working on right now is based on her life. But so February 15th, 2016, I wrote this poem. And here it is. Birthday. Mama put the daisy in her mouth and began to chew it whole. So I held out my hand to her in that universal gesture of mother to child or child to mother, and she spit it out petal by petal while I stared at her eyes instead of at the palm of my hand, mesmerized by her confusion. Earlier, I had taken a photo of it as she held it, this white daisy, thinking I might need a snapshot to remember this afternoon. It was my birthday. I was sharing a daisy and a piece of cake, but the cake went untouched, the way happy birthday went unspoken. And I sang to myself in the car as I drove home later, my hands still wet with my mother's bitter spit. So I wrote birthday to remember the moment more honestly, more carefully, more precisely, as I often do with poems, where we can recapture the emotional content along with the factual scene. I do take a lot of photographs, and so along with the journal entry, I have many photographs from that very special afternoon, which signaled the point at which my mother entered hospice. Not that afternoon, but the week before. But it was the woman who opened the door is actually a hospice worker who found me jumping up and down outside my mother's window trying to get a peek at her because I thought I can't go a birthday without having some interaction. And we weren't allowed in then because it was flu season. Plus, I was supposed to avoid illness and had just been very ill the week before because I had spent some time with her in the ER. And so that was just a complicated but very special time in life. So I gave her a flower, and my journal became so much more honest in the poem. And so I think, I'm supposed to thank, since this is being recorded places, Snapdragon. I will thank Snapdragon for publishing this poem. So I don't come out and explain why she ate the daisy, but I think you all can figure that out. And you also notice that I changed the Godiva chocolate somebody had given me for my birthday into birthday cake because I wanted to give myself a piece of birthday cake. I don't often get birthday cakes. And so I made up one. And I think one thing you'll hear later in the last poem I read is sometimes I create happy endings or happy moments and other moments. So that birthday visit was one of the most joyful I have ever had, and yet one that broke my heart completely. So and Gregory Orr, I don't know if you know his work, he's a poet who's written a good bit about how poetry keeps us together mentally and helps us work with the traumas life gives us. He says, not only has the poem helped the self survive its crisis, it has assisted it in assimilating and integrating what he calls the disorder into ongoingness. That's a fancy way of saying a poem helps us to process what happens, even if it takes years. And so, and I'll pause and say, because Mama had dementia, I think one reason I write a lot down in journals, day books, I write things down everywhere is because I guess I don't trust memory. At the same time, I've always written stuff down since I was a tiny child, so who knows. Anyway, second, along with writing poems to connect with the truth, and if you ever need to stop me, just, interrupt me at any point, that's okay too. That's what I tell my students or told my students, interrupt me at any point. Second, along with writing poems to connect with the heart of the truth, as I was trying to with that last poem, we can use them to explore the truth we may not quite know or understand. So writing can be a way of exploring memories. And so this next poem is based on a family folk tale that my mother told often owned when I was a little girl. And I grew up with this story. And the story you will hear in the poem, I created a borrowed voice from the little girl who was the source of the story my mother would tell. And then the first section and the second section, it's my adult voice making sense of the story. And I will thank Ink and Letters for publishing it. So it is called Backyard History Lesson, Bishopville Highway. We lived on the Bishopville Highway, I guess, the first 3 years of my life outside Sumter in a little rural community. So, what she said, he stood there, I promise he did, right there in front of the house, my house, our house. I promise he did. He did stand there, right there, as close as a whisper. And there he was with his pointed head, white from head to toe, his finger pointing at my house, our house. There he was by the house, flinging fire from his finger like a dog shakes water, and it all burned down. What I heard. It was the pointy head and faceless white face that mesmerized me. I stared into the sky for a UFO above our neighbor's ruins, hoping to see what she saw, what she said she saw over and over to anybody she asked. And people ask, anybody who asked, and people ask. Only her cotton picking parents silent on the subject. I thought it was a space alien until one day I grew up and the story burned down. So that was a poem I wrote when, you mull things over your whole life and then one day they make sense. One day you think, oh, that's what that was, or at least I do. Sometimes I'm slow on the uptake. And so John Chardy wrote that poetry lies its way to the truth. And I think that's what I was trying to do with this poem. The poem is set in the late 50s. I need to say that. There's in the tone. And what I'm trying to describe in it is how a story we hear over and over as a small child will grow up along with us, ideally, as we grow up and learn about the world more and more. And so I guess I admit the story transcends the personal a little, but it's both truth and fiction. My main goal with it was to talk about a moral truth about where I grew up and things that can happen that aren't necessarily space aliens. People did in that time in my life believe in space aliens, and so here's the catch with that poem. If my father were alive, I could ask him. And I have a long list of things I would ask my father if I could. And I keep adding to that list. And I keep thinking, why did I not ask him this, that, because he would have explained it. He always explained things in a very factual sort of way. He was a journalist. He would have told me, I don't know. Anyway, so there's that poem, Mystery. This next poem is also about a kind of a mystery. Another reason I like to write poems is to explore and make sense of family history and secrets. And so sometimes, sticking closer to biographical facts or whatever. But in this case, I took on a topic nobody in my family ever spoke about, my maternal grandmother's death. In 1939, I became curious about how she died when I was working on a project based in family story and intergenerational trauma, and which was the focus of a sabbatical I took a few years ago. So I looked up her death certificate, which is freely available on Ancestry.com. So I'm not airing dirty laundry here although I probably would anyway. I thought she probably died of cancer because she was so young. She was just barely 40. And because there's so much cancer in my family. And so when I looked at the death certificate, I saw something else, and I'll talk about that after I read the poem. But it was an archaic diagnosis that we don't use so much more anymore, but an archaic diagnosis often used with women back then and in the 19th century. And so let's see. So I've explored that diagnosis, talked to family members, looked at records from the state hospital, et cetera, but it still remains a mystery and will remain a mystery because anybody who would know is dead. So Frederick Buechner says, in telling secrets, secrets are telling in the sense that they tell what is perhaps the central paradox of our condition, that what we hunger for, perhaps more than anything else, is to be known in our full humanness, and that is often what we also fear more than anything else. So it's one reason I've always been more interested in the family secrets than the stuff that's so self-evident. This is called Lemon Shortbread Cookies, and it has a little epigraph. After reading Irvin M. Derby, MD, on manic depressive exhaustion deaths, 1933. While reading about how my mother's mother might have died, I eat 2 lemon shortbread cookies, the tang of lemon complementing the sumptuousness of butter in my mouth. Prolonged treatment and tepid pack and judicious use of bath are presented as contributory causes of death, not her death necessarily, but deaths not unlike her death in a similar asylum almost 100 years ago, before I was born or learned to cook. The best way to make shortbread is to use powdered sugar. Add the grated lemon to the sugar and butter as you cream it. Then add flour, a cup of flour for each cup of powdered sugar. Improper nourishment and failure to tube feed early can promote a fatal termination of the manic patient. I bake shortbread in a greased pan and cut it later as it cools, taking the brittle squares into my hands as soon as I can, although lemon shortbread tastes better the second day. So here's the backstory. In 1939, the Great Depression, which included 10 hard years for my grandmother following the loss of her home and the death of her oldest daughter, and the caregiving of her 2 other daughters, which also involved putting them out in different homes so they would have more. My grandmother Ruth was working as a housekeeper at the time at the YMCA when she was committed to the state hospital in Columbia by her father, and she died 6 days later. So what I found on the death certificate is this. So Bob Hill, you probably know these archaic, and Jane, you know these archaic. Anyway, it said, exhaustion, she died of exhaustion due to mental excitement secondary to undiagnosed psychosis. And I read that 6,000 times, called every relative I knew, including my first cousin on my mother's side. We had both been told different things about how our grandmother died. My mother said she went back to work too soon after a hysterectomy. My cousin's mother said something else. So, and everybody said something else. So long story short, it didn't make sense. Undiagnosed. How do you die of something undiagnosed anyway? I was able to get her committal papers from the asylum, and they were blank, even though the first page said person not to be admitted until all of these papers are filled out. top to bottom. And so all that lovely information was not there because she was just put in there without the proper procedure. And the only thing is the number that was assigned to her at her death before they took her away, at least to a family cemetery. Not everybody gets that. So my curiosity, since I wasn't getting a lot from family, led me into reading psychiatric journals from back in the day. And I've always been quite interested in psychiatry and the treatment of women in the 19th century and the early 20th century. And so who knows, maybe I overheard stuff when I was a small child, maybe I overheard my mother, who knows. But I've always had a fascination for that. And so this one doctor, the one that I referenced there, said too many women are dying of this bizarre diagnosis. What are they really dying of? And he went in and he was able to classify that, and I was able to read about it in graphic detail, and it was all quite horrific. So that I still don't know, you just don't know. And I sort of tiptoed around the horrific in the poem. I didn't include everything. So that poem and embroidering on my family history is sort of tiptoeing around my grandmother's story and sort of juxtaposing it with food, because starvation was one of the reasons sometimes people would die. They would just quit eating, or whatever. I just thought, and I was making lemon shortbread around the time I wrote this poem. And you can enjoy something simple so much. Especially in the context of thinking about the hard life other people have had. And so I'm not reading this poem today, but the poem about my paternal grandmother is quite cheerful, and it's about her strength and how she worked in a factory during World War I and helped build airplanes. But so that's my grandmother's mother, and she was the central mystery of my mother's life. I think once I found that out about my grandmother, my mother made sense. I had found out all kinds of things about her through her life and my life, but that also helped me make sense of often things she'd done when I was a child that I didn't understand or agree with. And I thought, now I understand. So not to go on forever, but so in the 7th grade, I was in a so-called gifted program and cried a lot over math homework. And my mother worked long and hard to get me out of that so that I wouldn't have temper tantrums over math. And at the time I didn't care, I was maybe, I don't know. Anyway, I just thought that was good. And then another year she said, you're involved in too many activities, you're getting overextended, pick one to give up. And she just did stuff like that. As a child, you don't say explain your reason and go back 50 years for this, but she was a loving mother at times when maybe when I was a child, I didn't see that. Didn't know she cared about me a lot. So this next to last poem, and the last one's very short and cheerful. So here's a poem, I think, fourth. Sometimes we use poems to speculate. So in the last poem, it wasn't entirely speculation. It was tiptoeing around the most I can know of something I can't know 100%. But sometimes there are stories we cannot know as hard as we try. And so this is about one of those, or although I persist in believing I will know, and have made some progress with this one. And this is a poem where I muse, and I think when we muse, we reflect on the great mysteries of life. And I've always been interested in musing in my poems. My very first poem at the age of 6 was one long question about identity. And my first word was one long question about something. Anyway, I've always been questioning. So this, I should mention, I forgot to say the last poem was published in Dash. This poem was my first international publication, and it was in Amsterdam Quarterly. And it was inspired, I'll give them credit, by my students in a senior seminar I taught on the Underground Railroad at Emory and Henry a couple of years ago. So, a poem for lost ancestors. I wonder who they are, the missing links, as I stare at a few small red strips on a DNA report that reflects the history of the peopling of South Carolina in my one genome. All my ancestors traveled far to make me, I know, and I know so many of them already, but not all of them. There was an underground railroad. I think there was another railroad some of my ancestors had to travel to. It ran not from south to north or east to west, but from generation to generation, their lineage stitched in the pockets of jeans as invaluable as silver coins sewn into skirts. With each child born, another coin spent. Color in South Carolina determined who went in what door or drank at what water fountain, and who stayed home to clean house, or who married whom and who moved to Paris or another neighborhood to start over. I want somebody to take me there, to that point of departure when a trade was made, unfair as a fast train, spiriting away a girl colored by society's prejudice and fear. I close my eyes and see her waving from the metaphorical train, waving at everyone who came before her as she passed on and into me, so white she has become a ghost of herself. I want to call back and call her Granny. So Pablo Neruda said, in the House of Poetry, nothing endures that is not written with blood to be heard with blood. Not all of my poems do that, but this is one I'm glad I got out there in the world. It took like 6 million drafts to get there, where I wanted it to be. So fifth, and then the last little poem I'm going to read, I'll say not all the poems I write are complicated. Some are very simple. And the first poem I read was simple on the surface, but kind of more complicated underneath the surface. This one's a little snapshot, and a lot of my poems are like little snapshots to help me remember. And it illustrates, ironically, so T.S. Eliot said poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It's the expression of personality. Not an expression of but an escape. And so that was this sort of modernist idea, the sort of sterile sense of poetry. So it illustrates that, but you won't know why until after I read it. And Wordsworth's idea that I love much more, that poetry is great emotion recollected in tranquility. So this is a little poem that I worked on out of another poem that was an earlier draft for a book called 100 Memories. It's a collection of poems published in England for use with Alzheimer's patients. So in this poem, I stripped everything bare to give a sweet memory for people working with family members to have something to, talk about. So it's called Piano. Daddy worked nights, so I did not always see him, but sometimes I woke up to find the piano tuned. He used a pair of pliers to tighten wires and rubber bands to hold hammers taut. He always came to recitals, but what I remember most is one time I stayed up late and met him at the piano. I played song after song as he sat and drank a beer, naming each tune within seconds. Our game kept us up until dawn with so many melodies he had heard played better, though he would never tell. So my father just loved music, and he also was, anyway, had sort of a game brain. So it was a very sweet moment, and people love this poem. And what's interesting to me is that it's taken out of context. It's just one little slice in my life. So you don't know what happened before and what happened after. And my childhood was lovely. It was quite lovely, but it was also a bit Southern Gothic. And so, life is full of paradoxes. And so the childlike voice in this poem, I think, fuses an adult selection of details with a child's joy at a happy moment. And this is one of the poems I've discovered that I like to write to create happy endings and to create happy stories, which I don't think is the worst thing we can do with our poems. Sometimes we have to write happy endings or happy middles. So anyway, to close and to invite discussion, I'll say, well, I've shared 5 poems, and I've talked about what Harry said, how we create our lives to our stories and our stories to our lives. And Harry said a good narrative makes a good life. And I've tried to extend that notion a bit this morning to suggest that sifting through the facts of experience and the great mysteries is a human impulse, whether we do it in verse or song or conversation. And so this is the point where I'll shut up and hope for a question or something.